Hi, welcome to Strange Doctor's channel. This is the place where we dive into strange and exciting stuff, or any other uniquely awesome stuff. Thank you so much for coming. Hit that subscribe button, and let's get started on today's adventure. Chapter 1, Start of the Adrift. The wind howled, tugging at the tattered remains of our sail, which hung lifelessly from the broken mast. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning a peaceful day on the water into a nightmare. Our small boat, once a symbol of freedom and adventure, was now a helpless speck in the vast, angry ocean. I gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands, but it was no use. The sea was in control now. Beside me, my wife Amy clung to the side of the boat, her eyes wide with fear. We had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. The boat shuddered violently as another massive wave crashed over us, nearly capsizing the vessel. Water flooded the deck, and I knew we were in serious trouble. "Hold on!" I shouted over the roar of the storm, though my voice sounded small and insignificant against the fury of nature. Amy nodded, her face pale, and I could see the same realization in her eyes. This might be the end. Then, suddenly, the world seemed to drop away. The boat pitched forward, and I lost my grip on the wheel. The next thing I knew, we were airborne, thrown like a toy by the monstrous wave. The impact when we hit the water again was bone-jarring. I was thrown clear, tumbling into the churning sea, and for a terrifying moment I couldn't tell which way was up. But somehow I managed to break the surface, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, desperate to find Amy. The boat was gone, swallowed by the waves, but then I saw her, clinging to a piece of debris a few yards away. "Amy!" I called, swimming toward her with every ounce of strength I had left. She turned her head, and relief washed over me as she reached out a hand. "I'm here," she yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. I grabbed her hand, and together we fought to stay afloat. The current was strong, pulling us away from each other, but we held on, refusing to be separated. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. It was impossible to tell. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Just when I thought we couldn't hold on any longer, I felt something solid beneath my feet. "Land!" I gasped, barely able to believe it. We staggered onto the shore, collapsing onto the wet sand as the last of the waves dragged at our feet. The storm raged on, but we were safe for the moment. When the storm finally passed, the island revealed itself in the pale light of dawn. It was small, barely more than a speck of land in the middle of the ocean, with dense jungle and rocky cliffs rising from the shore. There was no sign of human habitation, and our boat was nowhere to be seen. "We need to find shelter," Amy said, her voice hoarse. Despite everything, she was calm, practical. It was one of the many things I loved about her. We explored the island, looking for anything that could help us survive. The jungle was thick and foreboding, but we managed to find a small cave in the cliffs, sheltered from the wind. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Days turned into weeks as we struggled to survive. We scavenged what we could from the wreckage that had washed ashore, pieces of our boat, a few supplies, anything that could be useful. We learned to fish in the shallow waters and gathered fruit from the jungle, always wary of the creatures that might be lurking in the shadows. The days were long and exhausting, but at night, as we huddled together for warmth, we would talk about home, about the life we had left behind, the people we loved, and the future we still hoped to have. One night, as we sat by the fire we had managed to build, Amy looked at me with a determined glint in her eye. "We're going to get out of here," she said, her voice steady. I nodded, though I had my doubts. The island was isolated, and there was no sign of passing ships or planes. But Amy was right. We couldn't give up. The next day, we began working on a plan. We salvaged everything we could, using the remains of our boat to build a makeshift raft. It was crude, but it would have to be enough. We spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, and waiting for the right moment. Finally, the day came. The sea was calm, and the sky was clear, a rare opportunity. We loaded our supplies onto the raft and pushed off from the shore, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The journey was grueling. The sun beat down on us mercilessly, and the open ocean was vast and unforgiving. But we had each other, and that was enough to keep going. Day after day we paddled, guided only by the stars and a stubborn determination to survive. Then, just when we were beginning to lose hope, we saw it, a faint outline on the horizon. At first, we thought it was a mirage, a cruel trick of the mind after so many days at sea. But as we got closer, the outline became clearer, more real. Land. Tears streamed down Amy's face as we paddled toward the shore with renewed energy. It wasn't the mainland, but it was a large island, and more importantly, there were signs of civilization. Smoke rising from a distant village, boats anchored in a small harbor. We had made it. As we staggered onto the shore, exhausted but alive, we were met by a group of villagers who spoke in a language we didn't understand, but their smiles were universal. They led us to their village, where we were given food, water, and a place to rest. That night, as we lay in a real bed for the first time in what felt like forever, I took Amy's hand in mine. "We're going home," I whispered. She smiled, squeezing my hand. We never gave up. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Because Chapter 2, Beneath the Surface. The warmth of the fire in the village elder's hut did little to thaw the growing unease in my chest. Amy sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly, both of us too exhausted to speak, but too alert to sleep. The villagers had been kind enough, offering food and water, but there was something in their eyes, a lingering look, a coldness beneath the surface, that set me on edge. As the night wore on, the village seemed to grow quieter, the distant sounds of laughter and conversation fading into an eerie stillness. The elder, a tall, stern-looking man with deep-set eyes, had left us alone, saying he needed to consult with the others about our arrival. That word had hung in the air like a bad omen. "I don't like this," Amy whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Something's not right." "I know," I murmured, glancing around the hut. It was small, with rough wooden walls and a low ceiling. A single door led out to the rest of the village, but the shadows outside made it seem like a portal to another world. We need to be careful. Before we could discuss it further, the door creaked open. The elder returned, flanked by two younger men, both armed with crude, sharp spears. My heart sank as I noticed the hardened expressions on their faces, the way they looked at us as if we were prey rather than guests. "Please," the elder began, his voice dripping with a false kindness that made my skin crawl, "come with us. We need to discuss your situation." I exchanged a glance with Amy, who nodded slightly. There was no choice but to follow. We stood up slowly, trying to mask our growing fear, and allowed ourselves to be led out into the night. The village was dark, illuminated only by a few flickering torches. The huts that had seemed so welcoming just hours before now loomed like ominous sentinels. As we were guided down a narrow path, I noticed that the other villagers were watching us from the shadows, their faces expressionless, their eyes cold. The elder led us to a large building at the edge of the village, its walls made of thick, rough-hewn logs. The two men opened the heavy wooden door, revealing a dimly lit interior. My stomach churned as I realized what it was: a jail. The elder gestured for us to enter, his smile tight and unconvincing. "This is for your own safety," he said, as if that made any sense. "We must determine what to do with you." Amy hesitated, but I squeezed her hand and gently nudged her forward. We stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening thud. The room was small, with two narrow wooden benches against the walls and a single barred window high above, barely letting in any light. "What do you mean? Determine what to do with us?" I demanded, my voice hardening as I turned to face the elder. "We're just trying to get home." The elder's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "This island has rules," he said, his tone suddenly devoid of any pretense of hospitality. "Outsiders are not welcome here. You have brought disruption to our way of life, and we must decide if you are a threat." "A threat?" Amy's voice was incredulous. "We're shipwrecked survivors. We haven't done anything wrong." The elder ignored her outburst, nodding to the two men who had escorted us. "Guard them until a decision is made. No one is to speak to them." With that, he turned and left, the door slamming shut behind him once more. The two guards took up positions on either side of the room, their expressions unreadable. I pulled Amy close, wrapping my arms around her as we sat down on one of the benches. "We'll figure this out," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The hours dragged on, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional murmur of voices outside. I tried to stay alert, my mind racing with thoughts of escape, but the exhaustion of the past days weighed heavily on me. Amy's breathing eventually evened out as she drifted into a restless sleep, her head resting on my shoulder. I fought to stay awake, every creak and whisper outside the door setting my nerves on edge. Just as I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness, the door creaked open again. I tensed, ready to defend us if necessary, but to my surprise it wasn't the elder or the guards. A young woman stood in the doorway, her face half hidden in the shadows. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before slipping inside and closing the door quietly behind her. "Please," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "You have to leave, now." I stared at her, unsure if this was some kind of trick. "Why are you helping us?" I asked cautiously. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was also a flicker of determination in them. "Not everyone in the village agrees with the elder," she said. "There are those of us who want to help, but we can't do it openly. If you stay, they will kill you." The bluntness of her words sent a chill down my spine. I shook Amy gently, and she woke with a start, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "We need to go," I told her softly. "Now." The young woman nodded, motioning for us to follow. "There's a path through the jungle that leads to the other side of the island," she explained as we slipped out of the jail. "There's an old fishing boat there. It's not much, but it might be enough to get you away from here." We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, the village fading into the darkness behind us. The jungle was thick, the undergrowth clawing at our legs as we pushed through, but the thought of escape kept us going. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small cove on the far side of the island. The boat was there, just as she had said, a rickety, weathered thing that looked like it had seen better days. But it was our only hope. "Thank you," I said, turning to the young woman. "We owe you our lives." She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Just promise me you'll get far away from here," she said, "and never come back." We didn't need to be told twice. We climbed into the boat and pushed off, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore a strange comfort after everything that had happened. As we rowed out into the open sea, the island slowly disappeared into the horizon, its secrets and dangers fading into the distance. But the fear, the uncertainty, it lingered. We were free, but we had no idea what lay ahead. Amy rested her head on my shoulder, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Where do we go now?" she whispered. I stared out at the endless expanse of water, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to touch the sky. "We keep going," I said, my voice resolute, "until we find our way home." And so we did, driven by hope, by love, and by the unshakable belief that we could survive anything as long as we had each other. Muscles aching, our minds numb with exhaustion and fear. But beneath the weariness, there was a flicker of hope. We were alive, and we were free. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. The sun blazed overhead during the day, and the nights were frigid, the sky a blanket of unfamiliar stars. We were adrift in a vast, uncharted ocean, with no clear direction and no guarantee of survival. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull, a soothing rhythm that belied the danger we were in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and purple, Amy pointed to something in the distance. "Look," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of caution and excitement. "Is that land?" I squinted, trying to make out the shape against the fading light. It was faint, almost a mirage, but as we drew closer, it became clearer, a large landmass, much bigger than the island we had fled from. My heart raced. Could this be our salvation? As we approached, the outline of the island grew more distinct. It wasn't just a simple piece of land. It was mountainous, with lush, dense forests and towering cliffs that rose sharply from the sea. The sight was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. There was something ancient about the place, something that felt untouched by time. "This isn't on any map I've ever seen," Amy murmured, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar landscape. "Where are we?" I shook my head, equally bewildered. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice. We need to find food, water, and shelter. We'll figure out the rest later." We guided the boat toward a small sheltered cove where a stretch of beach offered the best place to land. The sand was white and fine, the water clear and inviting. But as we stepped onto solid ground, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The island was beautiful, but it was also eerily quiet. No sounds of birds or animals, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. We pulled the boat onto the beach and secured it as best we could, then set off to explore. The jungle was thick with vegetation, and the air was heavy with the scent of unfamiliar flowers. The terrain was rugged, with steep hills and deep valleys, but we pressed on, driven by the need to find fresh water. After what felt like hours of trekking through the dense undergrowth, we stumbled upon a stream. The water was crystal clear, and we drank greedily, grateful for the cool relief. As we rested by the stream, I noticed something strange, a series of large, smooth stones arranged in a pattern, almost like a path. "Do you see this?" I asked Amy, pointing to the stones. She nodded, her brow furrowed. "It's like someone or something put them here." A chill ran down my spine. We were in a place we didn't recognize, far from any known civilization. Yet there were signs of some kind of presence, something intelligent enough to shape the land. The question was, were they friendly, or did they pose a danger we couldn't even imagine? We followed the path of stones deeper into the jungle. The vegetation became thicker, the air more oppressive, and the sense of unease grew with each step. Just when I was about to suggest turning back, the jungle opened up into a clearing, and what we saw there stopped us in our tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone structure, partially overgrown with vines and moss. It was like nothing we had ever seen before, a pyramid-like formation, but with curves and angles that defied logic. The stones were carved with intricate symbols and designs, patterns that seemed to shift and change as we stared at them. "This can't be real," Amy whispered, her voice trembling. "It's like something out of a dream." But it was real as the fear that gripped us both. We were in a place beyond the known world, a place that defied everything we thought we understood about the Earth. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. As we approached the structure, I felt a strange energy in the air, a hum that resonated deep within me. The symbols on the stones seemed to pulse with life, as if they were trying to communicate with us. I reached out to touch one of the carvings, and the moment my fingers brushed the stone, a blinding light engulfed us. When the light faded, we found ourselves standing in a different place. A vast, open plain with a sky that was neither day nor night, but a twilight that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was still, and the landscape was dotted with more of the strange stone structures, each one as alien and impossible as the last. Amy clung to my arm, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice shaky. "But I think we've crossed into somewhere else." We wandered through the twilight world, searching for answers, for a way back to the world we knew. The structures were empty, devoid of any life, but they radiated a power that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Time seemed to lose all meaning, and I began to wonder if we would ever find our way home. But then, as we climbed a hill overlooking the plain, we saw it. Far in the distance, a single, familiar sight. A ship, a modern vessel, anchored in what looked like a bay on the edge of this strange world. Our hearts leaped with hope. If there was a ship, there might be people, and if there were people, there might be a way back to the world we knew. We made our way toward the bay, our pace quickening with each step. The ship grew larger, more real, and when we finally reached the shore, we saw that it was a research vessel, its sleek lines and modern equipment a stark contrast to the ancient, otherworldly landscape around it. A group of people stood on the deck, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity as they watched us approach. They lowered a ladder, and we climbed aboard, our legs shaking with relief and exhaustion. "Who are you?" one of the crew members asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Where did you come from?" I looked at Amy, and she squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "It's a long story," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "But the short version is, we're survivors, we've been through hell, and we just want to go home." The crew nodded, their faces softening with understanding. They led us to the ship's cabin, where we were given food, water, and a place to rest. As the ship prepared to set sail, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. A feeling that, despite everything we had endured, we were finally on our way back to the world we knew. As we left the strange island behind, I couldn't help but look back at the shore. The twilight world was fading, the stone structures disappearing into the mist. I knew we had crossed into a place beyond the known, a place that defied explanation. But we had survived, and we were heading home. And as the ship cut through the water, I held Amy close. Chapter 4, Unfamiliar Horizons. The gentle hum of the ship's engines was a constant reminder that we were finally on our way home. Amy and I sat together in the cabin provided to us, the walls adorned with strange, sleek panels that emitted a soft blue light. The crew had been kind, offering food and a place to rest, but there was an unsettling quality to the ship, something we couldn't quite put our fingers on. The crew members themselves were a curious bunch. They were all tall and lean, with pale skin that almost seemed to glow under the artificial lights. Their movements were precise, their speech clipped and formal. There was something odd about their eyes, too large, too reflective, as if they were seeing more than just what was in front of them. They didn't speak much to us beyond what was necessary, but when they did, their voices had a strange, melodic quality, almost hypnotic. Still, after everything we had been through, it was a relief to be safe, to be heading back to civilization. Or so we thought. Days passed and the ship moved through the ocean with an almost eerie efficiency. We never saw the stars, the sun, or the moon, only the endless, featureless sea that stretched out to the horizon. The crew assured us that we were on the right course, but there was an underlying tension in the air, something unspoken that made my stomach twist with unease. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore the ship. Amy was resting, her breathing steady as she slept, so I slipped out of the cabin, careful not to wake her. The corridors were empty, the blue lights casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems. As I wandered through the corridors, I noticed that the ship was much larger than I had originally thought. There were entire sections I hadn't seen before, doors that led to unknown places. The architecture was strange, with angles that didn't quite make sense. Hallways that seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. The farther I ventured, the more disoriented I felt, as if the ship itself was shifting around me. Then I found a door at the end of a narrow corridor. It was different from the others. Larger, more imposing, with strange symbols etched into the surface. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door's control panel. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity won out, and I pressed the button. The door slid open silently, revealing a room bathed in a soft green light. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The room was filled with large cylindrical tanks, each one containing a murky liquid. And floating within those tanks were people. Or at least they looked like people, but their features were distorted, their bodies unnaturally elongated. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The creatures in the tanks were humanoid, but their skin was translucent, their eyes large and vacant. Wires and tubes were connected to their bodies, and their faces were locked in expressions of eternal terror. A cold dread washed over me. These weren't just experiments. These were prisoners. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that whatever these beings were, they were using these poor souls for something unspeakable. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me, cold and emotionless. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to see one of the crew members standing in the doorway, his large eyes narrowing as he regarded me with a chilling indifference. His posture was relaxed, but there was a subtle threat in the way he blocked the exit. I was just lost, I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't mean to intrude. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether or not to believe me. This area is restricted. You will return to your quarters now. There was no arguing with him. I nodded quickly and hurried past him, my heart racing. As I made my way back to the cabin, the ship felt even more alien, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on me, the corridors stretching endlessly. When I finally reached our cabin, I found Amy awake, her eyes wide with concern. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice a mix of worry and relief. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I had seen. "I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk," I said, trying to sound casual. "But, Amy, something's not right. There's something wrong with this ship, with these people." She frowned, sitting up and reaching for my hand. "What do you mean?" I told her about the room, about the tanks and the creatures inside them. As I spoke, her face grew pale, and I could see the same fear in her eyes that I felt in my gut. "We need to get off this ship," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not taking us home, are they?" I shook my head, the weight of the truth settling heavily on my shoulders. "No. Wherever we're going, it's not home. It's somewhere else." The next morning, the ship's tone changed. The crew, who had been distant but polite, became more watchful, their eyes following our every move. The captain, a tall figure with an unsettlingly calm demeanor, informed us that we would be reaching our destination soon. There was no comfort in his words, only a cold finality. As we neared the end of our journey, the sea outside the ship began to change. The water took on an otherworldly hue, a deep, iridescent blue that seemed to pulse with light from within. The sky, which had been a constant dull gray, now shimmered with strange colors like a permanent aurora. And then we saw it, a vast landmass rising from the sea, but it was unlike anything we had ever imagined. The coast was lined with towering structures that twisted and spiraled into the sky, their surfaces smooth and reflective like liquid metal. The landscape was dotted with bizarre formations, plants and trees that glowed faintly in the twilight. As the ship docked, the crew became more animated, their movements quicker, more efficient. They herded us toward the exit, their voices brisk and commanding. I held tightly to Amy's hand, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. But as we stepped off the ship and onto the solid ground of this alien world, my hope began to fade. The air was thick with a strange metallic scent, and the ground beneath our feet pulsed with a faint, rhythmic beat, as if the entire planet was alive. The captain led us down a path that wound through the alien city, its streets lined with towering, organic structures that seemed to breathe and shift. The inhabitants of this world, tall, slender beings with luminous skin and eyes that glowed with an inner light, watched us with an unsettling curiosity. We were taken to a large, domed building at the center of the city. Inside, the walls were lined with more of the strange symbols we had seen on the ship, and in the center of the room was a raised platform with a single, pulsing crystal embedded in it. "This is your new home," the captain said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be cared for, as long as you remain obedient." The reality of our situation hit me like a tidal wave. We were prisoners once again, trapped in a world that was as foreign as it was terrifying. The crew, who had seemed so helpful, were nothing more than captors, delivering us to a fate we couldn't yet comprehend. But Amy and I had survived too much to give up now. As the doors to our new prison closed behind us, I squeezed her hand, a silent promise that we would find a way out of this nightmare, no matter what it took. And as we stared out at the alien landscape, the strange city pulsing with life around us, we knew that the fight for our freedom was far from over. The journey home, if such a place still existed, would be longer and more perilous than we had ever imagined. But we would keep going, together, until we found a way back to the world we knew, or died trying. We were taken to a large domed building at the center of the city. Inside, the walls were lined with more of the strange symbols we had seen on the ship, and in the center of the room was a raised platform with a single pulsing crystal embedded in it. "This is your new home," the captain said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be cared for as long as you remain obedient." The reality of our situation hit me like a tidal wave. We were prisoners once again, trapped in a world that was as foreign as it was terrifying. The crew, who had seemed so helpful, were nothing more than captors, delivering us to a fate we couldn't yet comprehend. But Amy and I had survived too much to give up now. As the doors to our new prison closed behind us, I squeezed her hand, a silent promise that we would find a way out of this nightmare, no matter what it took. And as we stared out at the alien landscape, the strange city pulsing with life around us, we knew that the fight for our freedom was far from over. The journey home, if such a place still existed, would be longer and more perilous than we had ever imagined. But we would keep going, together, until we found a way back to the world we knew. Chapter 5: The Descent. With the quiet grace of a predator, its sheer size dwarfing the endless ocean around it, Amy and I stood on the deck, gazing out at the horizon, hearts swelling with cautious hope. We had been through so much: shipwrecks, captivity, and otherworldly encounters. But now, finally, it seemed like we were on our way home. The crew of the vessel had welcomed us aboard with open arms, offering food, water, and a warm place to rest. Their ship was a marvel of engineering with smooth, sleek lines and technology that was far beyond anything we had ever seen. They spoke little of their origins, but they assured us that they were heading to a place where we could find our way back home. It was all we wanted to hear. Days passed, and the endless expanse of ocean stretched out in every direction, a featureless blue that seemed to swallow time itself. But then, one morning, we noticed something on the horizon. At first, just a dark smudge against the sky, but as we drew closer, it took on the shape of a small mountain rising from the sea. "That's it?" Amy asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Where are we going?" I shook my head, just as puzzled. The mountain seemed to grow taller as we approached, but it was still nothing more than a solitary peak jutting out of the water, with no land in sight. There was no sign of civilization, no harbor or port, just this lonely, imposing rock. But then something extraordinary happened. As we came within 500 feet of the mountain, it began to change. The rocky surface shimmered, and the solid stone seemed to melt away, transforming into a massive mechanical structure. The peak folded in on itself, revealing a vast, metallic pier that extended out to meet the ship, with smooth, gleaming surfaces and intricate designs that seemed to pulse with energy. Amy and I exchanged stunned glances as the ship docked against the newly formed pier with a gentle thud. The crew moved with purpose, guiding us off the vessel and onto the platform. The air was thick with anticipation, and my heart raced as I wondered what we were about to face. The crew led us toward a large, cylindrical structure in the center of the pier. As we approached, it became clear that it was an elevator, an enormous one, large enough to hold at least 20 people. The doors slid open silently, revealing a spacious interior with walls of polished metal and a faint hum of power that vibrated through the floor. We hesitated for a moment, but there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, we stepped inside the elevator, joining the rest of the crew. The doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing us in, and then the floor seemed to drop away as we began our descent. The ride was smooth, but there was a sense of weightlessness that made my stomach flutter. Amy squeezed my hand, her grip tight with nervous energy. We had no idea what was waiting for us at the bottom, but the unknown had become our constant companion. After what felt like an eternity, the elevator slowed to a stop, and the doors slid open. What lay beyond took our breath away. We stepped out into a world unlike anything we had ever seen. The space was vast, so vast that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The sky above us was a swirl of colors, from deep purples to bright greens, shifting and changing like a living aurora. The air was filled with the hum of energy, and the ground beneath our feet was covered in a soft, iridescent material that shimmered with every step. Towering structures dotted the landscape, their forms organic yet mechanical, like giant trees made of metal and glass. Some reached high into the sky, their tops lost in the swirling mists above, while others spread out across the ground, their branches extending in every direction. The buildings seemed to grow naturally from the ground, their surfaces smooth and flowing, as if they were alive. In the distance, we could see a city, a sprawling metropolis that glittered with light, its architecture unlike anything on Earth. The streets were filled with strange vehicles that hovered above the ground, moving silently through the air. The inhabitants were equally strange, tall, slender beings with luminescent skin and eyes that glowed with a soft inner light. They moved with a grace that was almost inhuman, their expressions calm and serene. Amy and I stood there, speechless, as the crew began to disperse, moving with purpose toward the city. One of them, a tall figure with a calm demeanor, turned to us and gestured for us to follow. "Welcome," he said in that melodic voice we had grown accustomed to. "You have arrived at the threshold. This is the gateway to the worlds beyond. Here, you will find the answers you seek." We followed, unable to tear our eyes away from the wonders around us. The city loomed closer, its details becoming clearer. The buildings were covered in intricate designs, patterns that seemed to pulse with life, and the air was filled with the soft hum of energy. As we entered the city, we were surrounded by the inhabitants, who watched us with curious eyes. Their expressions were calm, almost benevolent, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something we couldn't quite place. The crew that had brought us here blended seamlessly with the locals, exchanging words in a language that was both melodic and incomprehensible to us. The tall figure leading us guided us to a large building at the heart of the city. The entrance was grand, with arches that seemed to defy gravity, and the doors opened with a silent command from our guide. Inside, the space was even more breathtaking. Walls of shimmering light, floors that seemed to ripple like water, and a ceiling that mirrored the swirling sky above. We were led to a room where the floor was a translucent platform suspended above a vast, glowing chasm. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and unfamiliar, and the sound of distant, melodic chimes filled the space. "This is where you will stay," the figure said, his voice echoing softly in the vast room. "You are safe here. You will be cared for." There was a finality to his words that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to Amy, and I could see the same realization dawning in her eyes. This wasn't home. This wasn't a gateway back to the life we knew. This was something else entirely, a world beyond our comprehension, where the rules of reality were different, and where we were once again at the mercy of forces we couldn't understand. As the figure left us alone in the room, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss, I felt the weight of our situation settle over me like a heavy blanket. The wonders of this new world were undeniable, but so was the sense of captivity, of being in a place where we didn't belong. "We need to find a way out," Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't where we're supposed to be." I nodded, my mind racing. We had survived so much already. There had to be a way to escape this place, to find our way back to the world we knew. But as I looked out at the swirling sky and the impossible city, I realized that the journey home would be longer and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And in this new world, where nothing was as it seemed, we would have to rely on each other more than ever. Because as we had learned time and time again, the line between friend and foe was often as thin as a breath. And in this place, trust was the most precious and dangerous currency of all. Chapter 6, Shadows of the Deep. The strange twilight world beneath the earth had become our reality, a place where Amy and I had adapted and survived for what felt like an eternity. The days blurred together, filled with explorations of the vast underground city and its enigmatic inhabitants. We had grown accustomed to the alien life forms that surrounded us, their graceful movements and melodic language now a part of the rhythm of our lives. But everything changed the day the Earth-based military found its way into the hidden depths of this world. It began with a distant rumble, a sound that reverberated through the very fabric of the city. The normally serene inhabitants became agitated, their glowing eyes flickering with something akin to fear. Amy and I were in our small dwelling when the first tremors hit, shaking the ground beneath us. "What's happening?" Amy asked, her voice tight with concern. Before I could answer, the air was filled with the deafening roar of explosions, followed by the high-pitched whine of unfamiliar weaponry. The city, usually so quiet and peaceful, was suddenly alive with chaos. We rushed outside, joining the throngs of alien beings who were moving swiftly through the streets. Above us, the sky, if it could still be called that, was alive with flashes of light, bursts of energy that danced across the horizon. The structures around us, those towering organic buildings, began to shift and morph, as if responding to an unseen threat. Then we saw them, human soldiers, clad in advanced combat gear, their faces hidden behind masks and helmets. They moved in tight formations, their weapons blazing as they fired at the alien inhabitants. But the aliens were not defenseless. They fought back with strange, otherworldly powers, beams of energy that sliced through the air, shields of light that deflected bullets, and waves of force that sent soldiers flying through the air. The military had come prepared for a fight, but it was clear they were outmatched. The alien defenses were unlike anything they had encountered before. The soldiers were disciplined, their tactics sharp, but they were dealing with forces that defied the rules of conventional warfare. Amy and I were caught in the middle, desperately trying to find shelter as the battle raged around us. We ducked into an alleyway, pressing ourselves against the wall as a group of soldiers rushed past, their faces set in grim determination. "They found us," I said, my voice barely audible over the din. "They came for us." "But why now?" Amy asked, fear and confusion in her eyes. "Why didn't they come sooner?" I shook my head, unable to answer. The timing was strange, almost too perfect, but there was no time to dwell on it. We needed to stay alive. The ground beneath us trembled again, this time more violently. A massive explosion lit up the sky, followed by a shockwave that sent us sprawling to the ground. I looked up and my heart sank as I saw what was happening. The military had detonated something big. A nuclear bomb. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The military had come to destroy the aliens, to wipe out the threat, and they had brought the deadliest weapon known to man. But they hadn't accounted for the consequences, for the fact that we were so far underground, in a place that defied the natural order of the world above. The blast wave tore through the city, obliterating everything in its path. The buildings, those magnificent structures that had stood for who knew how long, crumbled into dust. The alien inhabitants, with all their powers and defenses, were no match for the raw, destructive force of the bomb. They were vaporized, their strange, melodic voices silenced forever. Amy and I huddled together, clinging to each other as the world around us disintegrated. The heat was unbearable, the light blinding. But somehow, through sheer luck or some twist of fate, we survived the initial blast. The military found us in the rubble, pulling us from the wreckage, just as the city collapsed in on itself. We were rushed to the surface, our heads spinning, our bodies weak from shock and radiation exposure. The soldiers who had saved us were somber, their victory hollow. They had accomplished their mission, but at what cost? As we emerged from the depths, blinking in the harsh light of the surface world, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The underground city, that strange and beautiful world we had called home, was gone, reduced to a wasteland of irradiated ruins. But the consequences of the military's actions were far from over. News of the nuclear detonation spread quickly. Across the globe, people began to fall ill, their bodies succumbing to radiation poisoning. Entire cities were affected, the fallout from the explosions spreading like a dark cloud across the planet. The death toll climbed and the world descended into chaos. Governments scrambled to contain the situation, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The underground detonation had unleashed forces beyond anyone's control, forces that were now wreaking havoc on the surface world. Amy and I watched helplessly as the world around us crumbled, just as the underground city had. The military's plan, executed with such precision and force, had backfired spectacularly. They had come to destroy a threat, but in doing so, they had unleashed a new one that could not be fought with guns or bombs. As we stood on the surface, surrounded by the devastation, I couldn't help but wonder if we had traded one nightmare for another. We were alive, yes, but the world we had returned to was one of fear, sickness, and death. The cost of our survival had been far too high. Amy squeezed my hand, her touch grounding me in the midst of the chaos. "We're still here," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We've survived everything else. We'll survive this, too." I nodded, though my heart was heavy with doubt. The world had changed, irrevocably. We had seen things, experienced things, that most people could never imagine, and now we were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered reality. The path ahead was uncertain, and the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. But we had each other, and as long as that was true, there was hope. Hope that somehow we could find a way to live in this new, broken world. We had survived the depths, the alien world beneath the earth, and now we would have to survive the consequences of its destruction. The journey was far from over, but we were still standing. And that at least was something. Chapter 7, Ashes of Tomorrow. The surface of the Earth, once a vibrant, teeming planet filled with life, was now a desolate wasteland. The sky, perpetually clouded with ash and radioactive dust, cast a sickly yellow-gray pallor over everything. What had once been forests, cities, and oceans were now unrecognizable landscapes of twisted metal, charred earth, and poisoned waters. The world we had once known was gone, replaced by a grim reality where survival was the only goal. Amy and I had dreamed of returning to the surface, of finding our way back home after the nightmare of the underground world. But now that we were here, the surface of the Earth was no longer a sanctuary. 3/4 of the planet's surface was ravaged by nuclear fallout, a deadly legacy of the bomb that had been detonated far below the ground. The land was toxic, the air barely breathable, and the few living creatures that remained were twisted, mutated versions of their former selves. We had become wanderers in this new world, scavengers in a land where food and water were more precious than gold. The infrastructure of civilization had collapsed, and the remnants of humanity, perhaps 5% of the previous population, were scattered across the globe, living in small, desperate communities, or wandering the ruins like ghosts. Every day was a struggle. We had to be constantly on guard, always alert for the dangers that lurked around every corner. The radiation was a constant threat, invisible but deadly, seeping into everything. We wore makeshift protective gear, scavenged from the ruins of cities, but it was a poor defense against the pervasive poison that had tainted the world. Finding food was our primary concern. In this new reality, anything remotely edible was a treasure. We dug through the ruins of supermarkets, raided abandoned homes, and searched the barren fields for anything that everything. Water was even scarcer. The rivers and lakes were toxic, filled with radiation and chemicals that made them undrinkable. We collected rainwater when we could, using crude filtration systems to make it safe enough to drink. But even the rain was tainted, carrying the fallout that had blanketed the planet. The people we encountered were shadows of their former selves, gaunt and hollow-eyed, resembling the motto, "Sticks and Bones." The once thriving cities were now husks, their streets filled with debris and the skeletal remains of those who hadn't survived. The few who were left were desperate, willing to do anything to stay alive. Trust was a rare commodity. Betrayal, theft, and violence were the norm. In this world, we were no longer citizens or neighbors. We were scavengers, predators, or prey. The old rules of society had dissolved into a brutal fight for survival. Everyone was out for themselves, and the idea of community or cooperation seemed like a relic from a distant past. Amy and I moved constantly, never staying in one place for too long. We had learned the hard way that settling down meant becoming a target. The world was filled with dangerous people, and we couldn't afford to let our guard down. Even when we found a small group of survivors, the camaraderie was fleeting. Trust was fragile, and resources were always scarce. One day, as we made our way through the ruins of what had once been a bustling city, we came across a group of people huddled around a small fire. They were thin, their clothes ragged, but there was a glint of hope in their eyes, something we hadn't seen in a long time. They offered us a place by the fire, and for a moment we let ourselves believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find some semblance of normalcy again. But that hope was short-lived. In the middle of the night, as we slept, they turned on us. Amy and I woke to the sound of footsteps, the glint of a knife in the firelight. They tried to take everything we had, our food, our water, our gear. We fought back, but in the struggle, Amy was wounded, a deep gash across her arm. We barely escaped with our lives, stumbling through the darkened streets, our breaths ragged and filled with fear. We found refuge in the shell of an old apartment building, where I did my best to tend to Amy's wound. But there was no escaping the reality of our situation. This world was not a place where hope could survive. It was a place of desperation, where every encounter could be your last. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, we learned to navigate this brutal new existence. We became hardened, more cautious, more ruthless when necessary. We had no choice. The world had changed, and so had we. But through it all, we held on to each other. Amy was my anchor, the one constant in a world gone mad. We had survived so much together, and as long as we were together, there was a reason to keep going, even if it was just to see another day. The world we had returned to was broken, a shadow of its former self. But as long as we had each other, we would continue to fight, to survive, to search for some semblance of peace in the ashes of tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Please help us grow by liking and subscribing.